So, do you eat ethically?
Thank you. I have to admit that I myself, even though we produced that video, I myself did not know the things in that video about 12 years ago. I was living right here in New York City. I was working at an immigrant worker organizing center out in Long Island, New York. I was actually sometimes organizing factory workers and custodial workers, restaurant workers even. I had just graduated from law school, and every evening I would come back right here to Manhattan, and I would enjoy the most amazing cuisine. I mean, we all do, right? Sometimes when you live in New York, you eat sometimes 3 times a day out, right? And that was me. I would enjoy everything that New York City had to offer. Asian fusion, raw food, vegan cuisine. It was wonderful. It was glorious. But I have to admit, in all of those years of eating out, before 12 years ago, I cannot remember a single person who touched my food. And I would argue that that's true for most Americans. We as Americans, we actually eat out more than anybody else on earth. Not just the frequency with which we eat out, it's that the fact that we eat out at the most intimate, special moments of our lives. I bet everybody here in this room can remember some extraordinary moment in your life in a restaurant. Weddings, anniversaries. I was proposed to in a restaurant. We celebrate very, very special moments of our lives in restaurants, but most of us cannot remember the people who touch our food, and I would argue that that's pretty purposeful. Well, that was me 12 years ago. I couldn't even see the people touching my food, and then 9/11 happened. And on September 11th, there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1, called Windows on the World. And on that morning, 73 workers died, and about 250 workers lost their jobs, and about 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs in the months and weeks that followed the tragedy. And I was called in to set up a little relief center that we called ROC. And what started as a little relief center post 9/11 has grown now into a national restaurant workers organization. We now have 13,000 members in 32 cities across the country, about 100 employer partners, restaurant owners who are doing the right thing, providing good wages and good working conditions, and several thousand consumer members. And we've won some things. We've won campaigns against exploitation in about 18 high-profile restaurant companies. We've recuperated about $9 million in stolen tips and wages for workers. We've opened our own worker-owned restaurants. That's actually our restaurant. That's not how we treat our workers. That was staged. We've opened one in New York, one in Detroit. We're about to open a third one in Washington, D.C. We've trained thousands of workers to move up the ladder to livable wage jobs. We've put out about 24 reports on the industry. We've raised the wage for tipped workers here in New York State and a couple of places around the country. So we've done some amazing things, but for me, the most amazing part of the last 12 years has been getting to know the stories of thousands and thousands of restaurant workers across the country and learning things I never knew as a consumer. I always thought as a New Yorker I should tip well. I was told when I first arrived in New York you should tip about 20%, so I always did. I had no idea that in New York and in 43 states in the United States, that tip that I was leaving was not a tip. It was, in fact, a wage because of a man named Herman Cain. Do you remember Herman Cain? So back in 1996, Herman Cain led the National Restaurant Association, which we call the other NRA. And back in 1996, the other NRA, under the leadership of Herman Cain, struck a deal with Congress saying that they wouldn't oppose an increase in the overall minimum wage as long as the minimum wage for tipped workers stayed frozen forever at $2.13 an hour, which is where it is today, and which is why when you leave a tip in most states in the United States, you are actually paying the worker's wage. There are right now over 10 million restaurant workers in America. In fact, it is the second largest and absolute fastest growing sector of the US economy. In fact, it's one of the only sectors of the economy to grow over the last couple of years of economic crisis, and yet it happens to be the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States. Every year, the US Department of Labor puts out the 10 lowest paying jobs in America, and every year we win the award. 7 of the 10 lowest paying jobs, and the 2 absolute lowest paying jobs in America, lower than farm workers, lower than every other type of position in the United States, are the people who touch our food. Why? How is it that you've got the largest and fastest growing industry in America proliferating the absolute lowest paying jobs? It is because of the NRA. It is because of these deals that they've struck over and over and over again at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, saying, you know what, America and Congress, we shouldn't have to pay our own workers' wages. You, customers, you should pay our workers' wages for us. We should only have to pay about $80 a week. And who are these tipped workers? Are they guys who work in fancy steakhouses taking home $18 an hour in tips? In fact, 70% of tipped workers in America are women. They work at restaurants like the IHOP and Applebee's and Olive Garden. They make a median wage of $8 an hour, including tips. They suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the US workforce, and they use food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the US workforce, which means the women who put food on our tables in America cannot actually afford to feed themselves. Take, for example, Claudia Munoz. She's a leader in our organization, a young woman, an immigrant from Mexico who ended up going to graduate school in Houston, Texas. And while in graduate school, she worked at the IHOP in Houston, Texas. And when she was there, her manager said, look, I know that tips are supposed to make up the difference between $2.13 an hour and the regular minimum wage of $7.25, but I don't care what you actually earn. I'm going to report that you're earning $7.25 no matter how many tips you actually bring in. And so sometimes when Claudia would take home $0 or $2 or $3 or $4 an hour, she never got a wage because her wages were so low they went entirely to taxes, and she would receive a pay stub that says, this is not a paycheck, and it would say 0. I can't tell you how many thousands of workers across the country have told me that same thing, that they get pay stubs that say, this is not a paycheck, and it says 0. Well, Claudia says, you know, earning $0 or $2 or $3 or $4 an hour, she says, Saru, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was so hungry and I so rarely was able to afford to eat that I would wait to get to the restaurant to eat pancakes, and even then it wasn't enough, so I would flirt with the cooks and the management to get more food to eat because me and the other women in the restaurant, were so hungry. And one night, Claudia worked a full night shift at the IHOP at Houston, Texas, and earned some money in tips, but at the end of the night, a couple walked out without paying the bill. And the manager said to her, even though it is illegal, and even though IHOP is a mega corporation, you're going to be held responsible for that bill. And so Claudia ended up paying $20 because that bill was $20 more than everything she had earned that entire night in tips for the luxury of having worked a full night shift at the IHOP in Houston, Texas. And again, I cannot tell you how many thousands of times I have heard that same story. And it's even worse for me as the mother of 2 little girls now, because I've given this talk about 200 times after my book came out. And every time I give the talk, some young woman or older woman comes up to me and says, I'm an IBM executive, I'm a corporate lawyer, I'm a union organizer, I've been sexually harassed on the job, but I never did anything about it because it was never as bad as it was when I was a young woman working in restaurants. Because these women have to interview for their wages with every customer that sits down, because their wages don't actually come from their employer. They come from the largesse of the customers. They have to put up with whatever the customers may do to them, however they may touch them or treat them, which is why the restaurant industry has the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry in the United States. And it is how we are introducing our daughters, who are likely to have the restaurant industry as their first introduction to the world of work, regardless of what they go on to do. This is how we're teaching young women in America that it is okay to be touched and treated. Fortunately, there is good news on the way. There is a bill right now moving through the Senate. After many years of fighting, the Fair Minimum Wage Act is finally moving through the Senate that would not only raise the overall minimum wage to $10, but would raise the wage for tipped workers to 70% of that, or $7. It would represent an increase, a 300% increase for tipped workers in America. It would be a big deal. But we've been told by people on the Hill that the only way to actually win this is to overcome the power of the other NRA, to build a groundswell of public support to overcome the power of the other NRA. And so we thought about that. Where had we seen a groundswell of public support? Well, you just heard, yes, there has been a groundswell of consumer demand for sustainable and local and organic. But when are we going to see that we cannot have actually truly sustainable food without sustainable conditions for the workers who touch that food? Because we cannot shop our way out of a problem. Consumption is important. And we as consumers definitely have power, but we cannot consume our way out of the problem. Because if we do, we cede our democracy to large corporations and corporate forces like the other NRA that are only too happy to tell us they shouldn't have to pay wages at all. So we are asking three things of everybody who eats out, everybody who eats, everybody who has a conscience. First, to get educated, read the book, find out what's happening behind the kitchen door. Second, speak up. We have actually a website called thewelcometable.net where you can sign a petition to let Congress know enough is enough. And lastly, please don't leave this room thinking that, gosh, I really should tip better. Because if we all just tip better, we continue to support an industry that expects us to pay its workers' wages with our tips. Instead, we need you to speak up every time you eat out. Every time you eat out, we have an iPhone app called the ROC National Diners Guide. It gives awards to good restaurants, like actually Tom Colicchio is an exceptional employer and gets an award in our guide. But there's also tons of other restaurants around the country who do the right thing. But it also tells you how most restaurants in America are faring on these issues. But we didn't create the guide to tell you where to eat and where not to eat. We created the guide to give you a tool to speak up every time you eat out, so that at the end of your meal you can say, I love the food, I love the service, but I would love to see you provide a livable wage. I would love to see you provide paid sick days. I would love to see you promote that person of color in your kitchen to be a server in the front of the house. I would love to see sustainable working conditions for the workers in your restaurants. Because you know what? That's the only way that we can actually have a sustainable dining experience, not just for the workers and the employers, but for every single one of us who eats out. Thank you.